This podcast was created as a supplemental learning resource for this course. The content is based on assigned course materials, including open educational resources, textbook chapters, instructor-developed explanations, examples, and applications connected to course topics. AI tools were used to help transform course material into a conversational podcast format, including the use of AI-generated narration. The AI narration is intended to make the material more engaging, accessible, and flexible for students. However, the podcast should not replace careful reading of assigned materials, reviewing course lectures, or completing course activities. Any interpretations, examples, or explanations included in the podcast are provided for educational purposes and are the responsibility of the instructor. Students should rely on the assigned readings, course lectures, and official course materials as the primary sources for exams, assignments, and class discussions.
So I want you to picture yourself sitting in like a massive cavernous university lecture hall.
Oh, yeah, we have definitely all been there.
Right. And the professor is up there just clicking through slides at a mile a minute. They are dropping names, dates, complex theories.
Just a total fire hose of information.
Exactly. And if you look around that room, you are going to see just a sea of glowing screens. You open your own laptop and you start typing frantically.
Trying to get every single word down.
Yeah, because it feels productive, right?
Yeah.
It feels super efficient. But here is the wild part. What if the very tool you are using to supposedly learn the material is actually actively preventing your brain from understanding it?
It is such a brilliant, unsettling question. And, it actually formed the basis of this landmark 2014 study by psychological researchers Pam Mueller and Daniel Oppenheimer.
I love this study so much.
It is so good. They were looking at this behavior that had become completely ubiquitous in education, typing notes, and they just asked, well, is this actually helping?
Which is the perfect place for us to start. Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. Today, we are looking directly at the nuts and bolts of psychological discovery.
We really are. If you are an undergraduate student diving into research methods, our mission today is to, pull back the curtain on the scientific method.
We are definitely not just going to read you a list of definitions to memorize. We're going to trace the entire life cycle of a psychological study.
Right, from that initial spark of a question in a classroom to the rigorous testing, all the way to figuring out what conclusions we can actually draw.
And we are starting with that Mueller and Oppenheimer laptop study because it just perfectly illustrates how a real-world observation turns into hard scientific inquiry.
Yeah, the background of that study is so fascinating because, for years, the debate around laptops in classrooms was entirely focused on distraction.
Like students just messing around on the internet.
Exactly. Researchers and professors just assumed laptops were bad because students were checking emails or scrolling social media or shopping online.
The whole concern was just multitasking.
Right. But Mueller and Oppenheimer shifted that entire paradigm. They hypothesized that even if you isolated the variable...
Meaning no internet, no distractions.
Exactly. Even if a student was using the laptop solely to take notes, it might still impair their learning compared to taking notes longhand with a pen and paper.
Which sounds kind of counterintuitive at first. So how did they test it? Because they couldn't just rely on anecdotes, right?
No, they had to design a really controlled empirical study. So they brought college students into a lab setting and had them watch TED Talks on various subjects.
Okay, so a pretty standard learning environment.
Yeah. And they assigned them to take notes either on a completely disconnected laptop or with a standard pen and paper.
No internet access for the laptop group then?
None at all. Then, and this is crucial, they distracted the students for about 30 minutes with totally unrelated tasks.
Oh, to clear their working memory.
Exactly.
Right.
They didn't want them just parroting back what they had heard 2 minutes ago. They wanted to test actual retention.
Okay, so then comes the test. And they didn't just ask one type of question, did they?
No, they asked two very different types. Factual recall questions, which are things like, in what year did this specific event happen?
Just basic memorization stuff.
Right. And then they asked conceptual application questions. These ask you to actually synthesize the information and apply it to a totally new scenario.
And the results were, they were highly illuminating.
They really were. On the factual recall questions, both groups performed roughly the same.
So laptops are fine for just memorizing dates.
Sure. But on the conceptual application questions, the students who took notes on laptops performed significantly worse than the longhand note takers.
Wow. And the mechanism behind why this happens is honestly the most interesting part to me. It all comes down to the physical limitations of writing versus typing.
Yeah, think about it. Most of us can type significantly faster than we can write by hand.
Oh, absolutely.
Because the laptop note takers could type so fast, They had this tendency to act as human court reporters. They were just blindly transcribing the lecture verbatim.
Just typing every single word the speaker said without really thinking about it.
Right. In cognitive psychology, we refer to that verbatim transcription as shallow processing.
Shallow processing. Okay, unpack that for us.
It basically means the acoustic information goes into your ear, it travels down your arm, and out through your fingers onto the keyboard.
But it never really stops in the brain.
Precisely. It barely touches the analytical centers of your brain. You aren't chewing on the information at all.
Right, you're just a conduit. But when you take notes by hand, you physically cannot write fast enough to capture a lecture, word for word.
It's impossible. And that physical limitation forces your brain to do something pretty extraordinary in real time.
You have to actually actively listen.
Yes. You listen to the professor, you hold the concept in your working memory, you synthesize it, strip away all the filler words, and reframe the core idea in your own words.
Just so you can quickly jot it down before they move on.
Exactly. And that friction, that sheer physical effort of writing, creates what cognitive psychologists call deep processing.
So you are literally building neural pathways and integrating new info just because you are forced to summarize.
You are. And that is why Mueller and Oppenheimer's study is just this elegant demonstration of the scientific method.
Because they didn't just write an opinion piece about how, kids these days type too much.
No, they identified a behavior, recognized a potential practical problem, designed a controlled methodology to test it, and analyzed the hard data.
And then they published a conclusion that fundamentally altered how we understand cognitive load and learning, which transitions us perfectly into the overarching framework of how science operates.
Because studies like the note-taking experiment, they don't just materialize out of thin air.
Right. They don't happen in a vacuum. They are part of this massive, continuous engine known as the cyclical model of scientific research.
The cyclical model is really the heartbeat of psychology. It is a continuous loop.
So let's map out that sequence for everyone. Where does the loop actually start?
It generally begins with a research question. A researcher observes something in the world and wants to know why or how it happens.
Okay.
To answer that question, they design and conduct an empirical study. They gather data.
And then comes the analysis phase, right?
Yeah, applying statistical methods to the data to see if the patterns are actually meaningful or if they're just random noise.
And based on that math, the researcher draws their conclusions.
But here is the critical pivot that makes it a cycle. The process does not end with a conclusion locked away in some private notebook. The researcher publishes those findings.
They enter the public domain. They become part of what we call the research literature.
Exactly. And once that study is published, it is read by thousands of other researchers around the world.
It's like a massive, ongoing group chat.
It really is. Those researchers look at the methods, they analyze the conclusions, and inevitably entirely new questions arise.
They might ask, does this laptop effect apply to middle schoolers as well as college students?
Or, what if we measured the variable using a different type of test? The answer to one question literally creates 3 new ones.
So the cycle loops back on itself, perpetually refining human knowledge. But wait, this cycle isn't a closed system, is it?
Not at all. It doesn't just run on academics reading other academics' papers all day. There are constant external inputs feeding fresh material into the machinery.
Okay, let's break those down. The text mentions 2 primary external inputs that drive scientific innovation: informal observations and practical problems.
Yes. Let's unpack informal observations first. This is the idea that you can just be like walking down the street, notice a pattern of human behavior, and essentially kickstart a formal scientific inquiry.
Which is pretty cool. And a classic demonstration of this is the 2007 study by Matthias Mayle and his colleagues.
Oh, the talkativeness study.
Yes. Their research question was born from an incredibly pervasive informal observation, one that is deeply embedded in cultural stereotypes.
The assumption that women are naturally inherently more talkative than men.
Right. You see it everywhere. In sitcom tropes, stand-up comedy, casual conversations. There was even a supposed number attached to it, right?
Yeah, the idea was that women speak around 20,000 words a day, while men speak only about 7,000.
Which is a huge difference. And that specific numerical claim had been floating around for years. I think it was even cited in some popular psychology books.
It was. But when Mel and his team actually combed through the rigorous, peer-reviewed research literature to find the source of those numbers, they realized something shocking.
There was no source.
Exactly. That 20,000-word figure had absolutely no empirical backing. It was a complete phantom statistic.
Wait, so no one had ever actually tracked and counted the daily word output of men and women in a natural setting?
Never. The scientific community just had this massive blind spot because everyone assumed the informal observation was already proving true.
That is wild.
Mm-hmm.
So Mel's team decided to actually test it. But the methodology they used is fascinating because measuring talkativeness accurately in the real world seems incredibly difficult.
It is notoriously difficult. Think about it. If you bring someone into a laboratory and say, okay, we're going to measure how much you talk now, they will instantly alter their behavior.
Oh, for sure. They'll clam up or they'll perform for the researcher.
Right. It's called reactivity. And you certainly can't just hand them a survey at the end of the day and ask, how many words did you say today?
Nobody has any clue. Self-report for something like that is totally useless.
So to solve this, the researchers used a device called an electronically activated recorder, or EAR.
Okay, the ear. How does that work?
They equipped hundreds of male and female university students with these small digital audio recorders. And the brilliant part of the EAR methodology is that the device is programmed to turn on periodically.
Like randomly.
Yeah. For example, it would record for 30 seconds every 12.5 minutes throughout the participants' waking hours for several days.
So it's just taking these random audio snapshots of their lives. It captures them in the cafeteria, studying in the library, hanging out in the dorms.
Exactly. And the participants eventually just forget the device is even there, which gives the researchers highly ecologically valid data.
Ecologically valid, meaning it represents real-world behavior, not fake lab-induced behavior.
Spot on. But then the researchers had to meticulously transcribe and extrapolate all those audio snippets to estimate the total daily word count for each person.
The logistics of transcribing all that audio must have been an absolute nightmare.
A monumental task. But when they finally ran the statistical analysis, the results completely shattered the stereotype.
What did they find?
The data revealed virtually no statistical difference. Women in the study spoke an average of roughly 16,215 words per day.
Okay, and the men?
Men spoke an average of roughly 15,669 words per day.
Wow, so they were basically identical.
Yes. When you account for the natural variance among individuals, that tiny difference is practically non-existent.
So the informal observation was put to the scientific cycle, and the resulting empirical evidence corrected a massive societal misconception.
And because they publish it, future researchers can now use that exact same EAR methodology to study other things, like how talkativeness relates to extroversion or depression.
Which perfectly illustrates how informal observations feed the cycle. Now, the second major external input is practical problems.
Right. This happens when a new technology or some social shift creates a tangible issue in the real world that urgently requires hard empirical data to solve.
And the most glaring example of this in recent history has to be the intersection of cell phones and driving.
Definitely. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, mobile phones just exploded in popularity.
Suddenly, you had millions of people driving 2-ton vehicles at highway speeds while holding a piece of plastic to their ear and talking.
The practical problem was incredibly obvious. Is this actually safe?
Now, at the time, cognitive psychologists already knew from foundational literature that human beings have a very limited capacity for divided attention, right?
Yes, the theory was already there. When you force the brain to perform a complex motor and perceptual task, like scanning a highway and anticipating hazards,
While simultaneously engaging in a complex verbal task, like a phone conversation.
performance inevitably degrades. Your brain just cannot do both well.
But the policymakers couldn't just ban cell phones based on a general theory of divided attention. They needed specific hard data on actual driving behavior.
So researchers like Collett and his colleagues began designing highly controlled driving simulator studies.
How do you do that safely?
They put participants in a mock driver's seat with screens simulating a highway environment. First, they established a baseline by having them navigate the simulation without any distraction.
Okay, just normal driving.
Right. Then they introduced the cell phone conversation variable.
But what specific metrics were they looking at? Because you can't just write down they drove worse. You have to actually measure it.
Oh, they measured precise behavioral outputs in milliseconds. They looked at brake reaction time, which is how long it took the driver's foot to hit the pedal when the car in front of them braked.
That is super specific.
They also measured following distance to see if drivers naturally overcompensated by dropping back. And they tracked lane adherence.
And the results, I'm guessing, were pretty alarming.
Unsurprisingly, yes. Reaction time slowed down significantly. Drivers also missed crucial visual cues in their environment, which is a phenomenon known as inattentional blindness.
Inattentional blindness. Wait, is that where you look at something but don't actually see it?
Exactly. You can be looking straight at a stop sign, but because your cognitive resources are tied up in the phone conversation, your brain simply fails to process the visual information.
That is terrifying. So those findings were published, injecting all this critical data into the research literature.
But the scientific cycle didn't stop there because the public and the policymakers actually pushed back.
Right, people started arguing, look, if I am legally allowed to have a conversation with a passenger sitting right next to me, why is it illegal to talk on a cell phone? It's just talking either way.
It is a very logical counter-argument on the surface. But researchers Drews, Pespathi, and Strayer in 2004 took that public counterargument and used it to formulate a refined research question.
Oh, I love this part. They asked, is there a functional cognitive difference between an in-car conversation and a cell phone conversation?
So they went right back to the driving simulator. This time they set up 3 conditions: driving alone, driving while talking to a passenger, and driving while talking on a hands-free cell phone.
And the distinction they discovered is absolutely vital. What happened?
Cell phone conversations proved to be significantly more dangerous than passenger conversations.
Even when it's hands-free. That's wild. What is the mechanism behind that?
It all comes down to shared situational awareness.
Shared situational awareness. Break that down for us.
When a passenger is in the car with you, they are embedded in the exact same physical environment. They are subconsciously scanning the road alongside you.
So if traffic suddenly halts, or if it starts pouring rain,
The passenger recognizes the increased cognitive demand on the driver, and they naturally stop talking. They moderate the conversation based on the driving conditions.
but the person on the other end of the cell phone is sitting in their living room, totally blind to your environment.
Exactly. The person on the phone has zero situational awareness. So right as you are trying to navigate a really complex 4-way intersection,
They might drop a highly emotional piece of news on you.
right, demanding your cognitive resources at the exact millisecond you need them most to avoid an accident.
It is brilliant how the researchers isolated that specific variable shared physical environment to definitively prove that the two types of conversations are not cognitively equivalent.
The cell phone driving research is just a triumph of the cyclical model. A practical problem emerged. The literature provided a foundation. Empirical studies provided raw data. The public offered a counter-hypothesis, and the researchers tested that refinement.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate for a moment, though. Because looking at this cycle from the outside, it can seem slightly maddening. Well, if researchers are constantly reading old studies just to tweak one tiny variable and run the study again, how does the scientific community avoid getting stuck in an endless loop of minor esoteric arguments? Like, how do they ensure they're actually moving forward?
That is the constant tension in scientific inquiry, honestly. It is true that some corners of the literature can become overly insular,
Right, just academics arguing with academics.
but the safeguard against that stagnation is the constant influx of those practical problems. The real world doesn't allow science to stay in an ivory tower forever.
Because new problems keep happening.
Exactly. Whenever a new societal crisis emerges, whether it is the impact of social media algorithms on adolescent mental health or a global pandemic, it acts as an anchor. It forces the machinery to address tangible human suffering.
So the cycle isn't a circle spinning in place. It is more like an upward spiral toward a more accurate model of reality.
That's a great way to put it.
Which brings us to a really crucial element of this entire process. We keep talking about a research literature as the foundation of this cycle. But if you are a student setting out to design your very first study, the literature sounds like an intimidating, monolithic wall of text.
It definitely can be overwhelming at first.
How do you actually navigate it?
Well, the first step is defining what the literature actually is in the context of psychological science. It is not Wikipedia, it is not a blog post by a life coach, and it is not an article in a mainstream magazine.
Right, those might be interesting starting points for an informal observation, but they aren't the scientific literature.
Correct. The research literature primarily consists of 2 things: peer-reviewed articles in professional academic journals, and scholarly books written by researchers specifically for other researchers.
Let's pull back the curtain on that phrase, peer-reviewed, because it gets thrown around a lot, but understanding the actual mechanics of peer review is essential to understanding why the literature carries so much weight.
Absolutely. When a team of researchers finishes their study, let's say that cell phone driving simulator study, they write up a really detailed manuscript.
And then what? They just publish it online.
No, they submit this manuscript to a scientific journal. The editor of that journal, who is usually a senior scientist in the field, reads it first. If it seems promising, the editor sends the manuscript out to several other experts in that specific subfield.
And these experts are the peers.
Yes. And crucially, this process is usually double-blind.
Double-blind meaning what exactly?
It means the reviewers don't know who wrote the paper and the authors don't know who is reviewing it.
That anonymity must be designed to strip away bias, right? Like you can't just accept a paper because your buddy wrote it.
Exactly. The reviewer's job is to aggressively audit the study. They examine the methodology looking for flaws. They ask, were there enough participants to achieve statistical power?
Did the researchers use the correct statistical tests?
Are the conclusions actually supported by the data, or are the authors overstating their claims? It is an intentionally brutal process.
The reviewers aren't there to be supportive friends. They are the gatekeepers of the scientific record.
Right. Most manuscripts are rejected outright, or they require massive revisions and further experiments before they are finally accepted.
So because of this gauntlet, when an article finally appears in a peer-reviewed journal, it carries a real stamp of methodological quality.
It does. But finding these articles can be tricky. You can't just type psychology of stress into a standard search engine and hope for the best.
You just get a bunch of pop psychology listicles. So how does a student access this treasure trove of vetted information?
To navigate the literature efficiently, researchers rely on specialized databases, the most prominent in our field being PsycInfo.
PsycInfo, produced by the American Psychological Association, right?
Yes. It catalogs millions of peer-reviewed articles, books, and dissertations. It functions like a highly specialized, hyper-organized search engine.
But you have to know how to speak its language, don't you?
You do. You use Boolean operators terms like A and D or R and not to narrow your search.
Oh, like coding logic. Give us an example.
If you want to study the effects of sleep deprivation on memory, you wouldn't just search the word sleep. You would get millions of hits.
Right.
Instead, you would search sleep deprivation and working memory, not infants, to filter out irrelevant pediatric studies.
That makes so much sense. And understanding how to navigate PsycInfo is vital because a literature review is the absolute prerequisite to any new research.
You have to do the reading first.
But I can hear a student asking right now, if the goal of science is discovery, why am I spending weeks reading dusty old papers? Doesn't reading everyone else's ideas stifle my own creativity? Shouldn't I just go into the lab with a completely fresh perspective?
It is such a common misconception that creativity in science requires total ignorance of the past. In reality, attempting to do research without reviewing the literature is like trying to build a smartphone from scratch without knowing what a microchip is.
You'd just be wasting your time.
Exactly. First, the literature prevents you from reinventing the wheel. There is nothing more demoralizing for a researcher than spending a year designing and executing a study only to discover that someone at another university answered the exact same question a decade ago.
You have to know what has already been settled so you can focus on what is still unknown.
Secondly, the literature is a catalog of methodologies. If you want to study how anxiety impacts decision-making, you don't need to invent a brand new way to induce anxiety in a lab.
You can just borrow one that already works.
Right. You can look at the literature, find a validated methodology like the Trier social stress test, where participants have to give an impromptu speech to a panel of stern judges, and borrow it. You stand on the shoulders of giants.
You map the known territory so you can locate the exact edge of the map. And that edge, the boundary between what we know and what we don't know, is where you find your research question.
Which brings us to the next critical phase, generating and evaluating those questions.
Okay, so you've read the literature, you've noticed the gap, you start brainstorming. But how do you know if the question you want to ask is actually a good scientific question?
Generating questions is often about looking at established variables and proposing new relationships. You take a known phenomenon and ask, does this change if we apply it to a different demographic?
Or, does this hold true in a high-stress environment versus a low-stress one?
Right. But generating the question is only the first step. You then have to put your question through a rigorous filter of evaluation.
The textbook outlines two major criteria for evaluating a research question: interestingness and feasibility. Let's break down interestingness first, because it sounds subjective, but it actually has a very specific definition in science.
It does. For a question to be considered interesting by the scientific community, it must meet a few benchmarks. First, the answer must be genuinely in doubt.
meaning we don't already know the answer.
Exactly. If the answer is already obvious or has been proven definitively 100 times, it isn't interesting. You wouldn't get funding to study whether human beings require oxygen to maintain brain function.
That's just a known fact.
Hmm.
Second, it has to fill a genuine gap in the literature. It needs to connect two isolated islands of knowledge.
And third, it should ideally have practical implications. The cell phone driving study is the ultimate example of practical interestingness.
Because it wasn't just a theoretical puzzle about cognitive load. The answer was going to dictate traffic laws and potentially save lives.
That is deeply interesting.
Okay, so you've brainstormed a question. It's groundbreaking. The answer is in doubt. It fills a massive gap, and it could change society. It has incredibly high interestingness.
But then
You slam headfirst into the second criterion, feasibility.
feasibility is where many undergraduate research streams meet harsh reality. Feasibility asks a very cold, practical question. Do you actually have the resources to pull this off?
It's the logistics of science.
Exactly. Time is a massive factor. If you are an undergrad, you likely have a single semester to complete a research project. You cannot design a longitudinal study that tracks childhood development over 10 years.
You just don't have the runway. Money is another brutal constraint, right?
Oh, absolutely. You might have a brilliant question about how political polarization affects the brain's amygdala. The most interesting way to study that would be to put participants into an fMRI scanner to watch their brain blood flow in real time.
But running an fMRI machine costs hundreds of dollars an hour.
Yes, and you need specialized technicians to run it and advanced computational software to analyze the terabytes of neuroimaging data it produces. If you do not have a massive grant, that study is simply not feasible.
Another major aspect of feasibility that students often overlook is access to participants and the ethical constraints governed by the IRB.
The IRB, or Institutional Review Board, it's a committee at every research institution tasked with reviewing the ethics of proposed human research.
Their primary job is to protect participants from physical and psychological harm.
Right. So if an undergrad comes to the IRB and says, I have a highly interesting question about how people process extreme acute trauma, so I want to simulate a terrifying emergency in the lab to see how they react.
The IRB is going to immediately reject that proposal.
Without a doubt. The risk of inflicting lasting psychological distress on the participants far outweighs the potential benefit of the undergrad's data. So while the question might be fascinating, it is ethically unfeasible.
You know, it reminds me of planning a grand road trip.
Oh, I like that. How so?
Well, interestingness is pitching the idea to your friends. Let's drive to the Arctic Circle to see the Northern Lights. It's adventurous, the outcome is in doubt, it's a huge gap in your travel history.
Sounds amazing.
But feasibility is the friend who looks at the logistics and says, guys, we have $40 in our checking accounts, our car's a 2006 sedan with bald tires, and we all have to be back at work on Monday.
The grand idea must yield to the practical constraints. Science really is the art of the possible.
A good researcher learns how to take a massive, unfeasible theoretical question and narrow it down into a highly specific, affordable, ethical study that can be completed in 3 months.
Exactly.
I want you, the listener, to just pause and think about this for a moment. Think about a psychological phenomenon you find deeply fascinating. Maybe it's the psychology of cult initiation, or how long-term isolation affects memory.
No, put on your researcher hat. How feasible would it be for you to actually test that tomorrow?
What barriers would you hit with funding, ethics, or time? Recognizing those boundaries is what separates a casual thinker from a rigorous scientist.
Beautifully said. And once you have a question that survives the gauntlet of both interestingness and feasibility, you move to the next structural phase.
You need to make a prediction about what you will find. Which brings us to a crucial terminology distinction that students must master. The difference between a theory and a hypothesis.
In casual, everyday conversation, we use those words interchangeably. You might say, oh, I have a theory about why the coffee machine is always broken.
But in the scientific lexicon, they operate on entirely different levels of abstraction. Let's start from the top down. What exactly is a theory?
A theory is a broad, overarching explanation or interpretation of a complex phenomenon. Theories are expansive.
They don't just describe what happens, they attempt to explain the underlying mechanisms of why it happens.
Right. Theories integrate many different observations into a single cohesive framework. And crucially, theories often involve concepts or processes that we cannot directly observe, like working memory capacity or cognitive dissonance.
Contrast that with a hypothesis. A hypothesis is narrow. It is a specific, testable prediction about the outcome of one particular study, conducted under specific conditions.
The textbook relies on a brilliant historical example to illustrate this relationship. Robert Zajon's 1965 formulation of drive theory.
Let's really dig into the mechanics of this, because it perfectly captures how theories synthesize confusing data. Set the stage for us.
Before Zajon proposed his theory, psychologists had been studying audience effects for decades, and the literature was an absolute mess of contradictions.
What do you mean by contradictions?
Well, sometimes researchers would find that having an audience watch a participant perform a task made them perform significantly better. They called this social facilitation.
Like a runner achieving their personal best time during a crowded Olympic final, rather than alone in practice.
Exactly. But in other studies, researchers found the exact opposite. Having an audience watch a participant caused them to choke, to make massive errors, and perform much worse than they did alone.
They call that social inhibition. So the phenomenon is completely paradoxical. The spotlight makes some people fly and makes others crash. How do you reconcile that?
Zajon developed drive theory to provide a single mechanism that explained both outcomes. His theory proposed two specific steps.
Step one.
First, he theorized that the mere physical presence of other members of your species creates a state of generalized physiological arousal.
Your autonomic nervous system kicks into a slightly higher gear. Your heart rate might elevate, you become more alert, you are physiologically driven.
Exactly. Step two of the theory states that this physiological arousal increases the probability of you executing your dominant response.
Let's define dominant response, because that is really the linchpin of the whole theory.
A dominant response is simply the behavior or action that comes most naturally and automatically to you in a given situation.
So if a task is highly practiced, deeply ingrained, or very simple, your dominant response is to do it correctly.
Right. For a professional concert pianist, playing a C major scale is a dominant response. They can do it in their sleep.
So, under Zajon's theory, if the pianist performs in front of an audience, the arousal kicks in, amplifies that dominant response of playing correctly, and they perform brilliantly. Social facilitation.
But what if the task is highly complex, novel, or unpracticed?
Okay, if you ask me to juggle 4 flaming torches for the very first time, my dominant response is going to be failure. I am going to drop them.
So if you put an audience in front of you while you try to juggle for the first time, the physiological arousal amplifies your dominant response of making mistakes.
I get flustered, my hands shake, and I perform even worse than if I had tried alone. Social inhibition.
It is a beautifully elegant theory. It takes an incredibly messy pile of contradictory literature and organizes it under a single, coherent framework. Audience leads to arousal. Arousal amplifies the dominant response.
Okay, so we have this grand theory. But a theory is too broad to test all at once. You cannot build a single experiment to test every audience effect on every human behavior.
No, that would be impossible. This is where the hypothesis comes in, through a process called the hypothetico-deductive method.
The hypothetico-deductive method, that sounds intense.
It's just the engine of hypothesis testing. You start with the broad theory, and you deduce a narrow, specific, testable prediction from it. You apply the theoretical rulebook to a specific scenario.
For example, using drive theory, a researcher might construct a hypothesis specifically about playing billiards.
They might hypothesize. If Zajon's drive theory is correct, then novice billiard players, whose dominant response is to miss complex shots, will sink a lower percentage of shots when a crowd of observers is standing around the table compared to when they play alone.
Notice how hyper-specific that is. It predicts an exact relationship lower percentage of shots under specific conditions audience versus alone for a specific population novices. That is a solid hypothesis.
And you would pair it with a second hypothesis. Conversely, expert billiard players, whose dominant response is to make the shots, will sink a higher percentage of shots when observed by a crowd compared to playing alone.
You then run the actual empirical study. You gather the novice and expert pool players. You manipulate the audience variable. You count the sunk shots.
And then you take your data and feed it back up the chain to evaluate the theory.
If the data matches your hypothesis, if the novices choke and the experts shine, your data supports Zajon's drive theory.
But if the data shows something completely different, say the experts choke and the novices suddenly play like professionals, your data refutes the theory, or at least suggests it needs to be heavily modified.
To cement this distinction, let's try an analogy. Tell me if this tracks. A theory is like the overarching rulebook of physics, aerodynamics, and structural engineering. It explains the broad concepts of lift, drag, and gravity.
I like where this is going.
The hypothesis is the specific prediction that if I build this exact paper airplane using this specific weight of paper and throw it with this exact amount of force, it will fly exactly 10 feet before hitting the ground.
That is an excellent way to conceptualize it. The theory is the invisible architecture governing the universe. Hypothesis is the specific bet you make on how one tiny piece of that universe will behave on a Tuesday afternoon in your lab.
Now, we're diving into the most mechanical, difficult, and frankly, most important section of the entire research cycle: variables and operational definitions.
This is where things get really concrete.
Right, because if you have a brilliant hypothesis about how frustration affects aggressive behavior, you can't just throw people in a room, watch them, say, yeah, they look pretty frustrated and aggressive to me.
No, science requires quantification. If you cannot define your variables precisely, you cannot measure them. And if your measurements are flawed, your entire study collapses, no matter how elegant your theory is.
Let's start with the fundamental building blocks. What is a variable?
Simply put, a variable is a quantity or a quality that varies across people or situations. It represents difference.
The opposite being a constant, like the speed of light in a vacuum, which never changes. But as we've noted, when you are studying human psychology, constants essentially do not exist.
Right. We vary in height, weight, extroversion, political beliefs, reaction times, neurochemistry.
And researchers generally categorize these variables into two main types, right? Quantitative and categorical.
Yes. Quantitative variables are measured numerically. They represent a specific quantity of something.
Height measured in inches, reaction time measured in milliseconds, the number of words spoken in a day.
Categorical variables, on the other hand, represent qualitative differences. They assign individuals to specific categories or groups.
Like declaring a university major. You are in the psychology category, the biology category, or the English category.
Exactly. You cannot be a quantitative 4.2 in the psychology major. You either have the label or you don't.
Identifying whether your variable is quantitative or categorical is crucial because it dictates the type of statistical analysis you will run later. But before you can run statistics, you have to cross the highest hurdle in research methods.
The operational definition.
This is where the magic and the frustration of psychology truly lives. An operational definition is the precise, specific procedure by which a researcher measures or manipulates a conceptual variable.
We deal with incredibly abstract conceptual variables in psychology. Love, depression, intelligence, stress, aggression.
You cannot put depression on a scale and weigh it.
You have to operationalize it. You have to translate the invisible concept into a visible, observable metric.
Let's look at one of the most famous examples of operational definitions in the history of psychology. Albert Bandura's Bobo doll experiment from the 1960s.
Oh, that's a classic. Bandura wanted to study the conceptual variable of physical aggression in children after they observed an adult modeling aggressive behavior.
The challenge Bandura faced was monumental, though.
Yeah.
How do you objectively measure aggression in a room full of toddlers?
It's so subjective. If you just have two researchers watching the kids and taking unstructured notes, one researcher might think a kid aggressively snatching a toy is high aggression.
While another researcher might think it's just normal toddler behavior, the data would be subjective chaos.
So Bandura had to operationally define physical aggression. He didn't just look for general meanness. He created highly specific behavioral criteria.
They placed an inflatable, clown-shaped Bobo doll in the room, and they operationally defined physical aggression by counting specific, discrete actions.
They counted the exact number of times a child struck the doll with a wooden mallet. They counted the number of times the child threw the doll in the air. They even counted specific, aggressive phrases the child shouted.
By breaking aggression down into number of mallet strikes, they transformed a philosophical concept into a hard, quantitative variable.
If a child hit the doll 10 times, their aggression score was a 10. This eliminates ambiguity. If another researcher on the other side of the world wants to replicate the study, they know exactly what to look for.
This reliance on operational definitions highlights a broader strategy in psychological research known as converging operations.
Right. Because human traits are so complex, a single operational definition rarely captures the entire picture.
Hitting a plastic doll doesn't capture verbal bullying or relational aggression like spreading rumors.
Exactly. So researchers use converging operations, using multiple different operational definitions across different studies to measure the same conceptual variable.
I want to run a quick exercise for you listening to really solidify this. Let's say you are tasked with designing a study on the effects of stress during finals week.
Okay, stress is your abstract conceptual variable. How many different ways can you operationally define it?
Let's brainstorm.
The most common approach would be a self-report measure. You could give the students a validated questionnaire, like the perceived stress scale, where they answer questions about how overwhelmed they feel on a 1 to 5 scale.
You sum up their answers, and that total numerical score is your operational definition of their stress.
But self-report can be flawed. Students might downplay their stress to look tough or exaggerate it to complain.
So what if we use a physiological operational definition instead?
You could measure the concentration of cortisol, the primary stress hormone in the student's saliva, or you could measure their resting heart rate.
Or their galvanic skin response, which measures how much they're sweating. In that case, stress is literally operationally defined as micrograms of cortisol per deciliter of saliva.
Or we could use a behavioral operational definition. We could measure how many hours of sleep they get the night before an exam.
Or how many times they compulsively check their phones during a 1-hour study session.
All three methods, the survey score, the cortisol level, the sleep hours, are valid operational definitions for the invisible concept of stress.
Choosing the right one depends entirely on your specific hypothesis and your feasibility constraints. Taking a saliva swab is a lot more expensive than handing out a paper survey.
And if a researcher finds that finals week increases stress when measured by surveys, AMD when measured by cortisol, AMD when measured by sleep loss, those converging operations give the scientific community massive confidence that the underlying phenomenon is real.
Which brings us to the final act of the cyclical model. You have your question. You've reviewed the literature. You've deduced your hypothesis. You've locked down airtight operational definitions.
You've run the study and collected a mountain of quantitative data. Now you hand that data over to the statisticians.
And here is where the general public and the scientific community often have a massive failure to communicate, drawing conclusions, and the massive problem with the word proof.
Yes, the textbook and the foundational philosophy of science are unequivocal on this point. Psychological research, and really all empirical science, is probabilistic in nature.
Probabilistic, meaning our conclusions are based on calculating the mathematical probabilities of our data, not on establishing absolute undeniable certainties.
Right.
But why is that? Why can't we just measure something and be certain?
Because of the fundamental limitation of sampling. When we want to understand human behavior, we are theorizing about the entire human population, billions of people.
But we obviously cannot test billions of people. We can only test a sample. Maybe we test 100 college students or 500 adults online.
And whenever you measure a sample instead of the whole population, you introduce the possibility of sampling error. Just by random chance, the 100 people you picked might be slightly different from the global average.
Exactly. When we run inferential statistics on our data, we are essentially calculating a complex probability. We're asking, assuming that our theory is completely wrong and there is no real effect in the global population, what are the mathematical odds that we would get data looking like this just by random chance in our specific sample?
If those odds are incredibly low, usually less than a 5% chance, the researchers declare their results statistically significant?
They reject the idea that it was just random noise, and they conclude that their hypothesis is likely correct.
But likely correct is not the same as absolutely proven. Because we are dealing in probabilities, there is an ever-present, unavoidable mathematical reality, the possibility of making an error.
The scientific framework formally recognizes two distinct types of statistical errors, type I and type 2 errors. Let's clearly define these because understanding these errors is the key to understanding scientific humility. Let's start with a type I error.
A type I error is a false positive. It occurs when your statistical analysis leads you to conclude that there is a significant effect or relationship in the population, but in objective reality, that effect does not exist.
It was just a fluke of your sample.
To use a visceral analogy, a type I error is a medical diagnostic test telling a perfectly healthy patient that they have terminal cancer.
The alarm bells are ringing, the data says there's a massive problem, but it's a false alarm. The fire doesn't actually exist.
It is the nightmare scenario for a researcher, because if you publish a type I error, you are injecting false information into the research literature. Other researchers might waste years trying to build on an effect that was never real to begin with.
And the opposite side of that coin is the type 2 error.
A type 2 error is a false negative. This happens when your statistical analysis leads you to conclude that there is no significant effect in the population, but in reality, The effect actually does exist. Your study just missed it.
Why might a study miss a real effect?
Often, it is because the sample size was too small, which reduces the study's statistical power. Or perhaps the operational definitions were too blunt to detect a really subtle psychological shift.
Going back to the medical analogy, a type 2 error is a diagnostic test telling a patient who is actively suffering from an infection that they are perfectly fine.
The fire is burning, but the smoke detector failed to go off.
Because the shadow of type 1 and type 2 errors hangs over every single statistical analysis ever conducted, rigorous scientists universally reject a specific phrase. You will never see a well-written psychological journal article state, "This study proves that..."
Scientific proof is an oxymoron.
It is. We cannot use the results of a single empirical study to conclude with absolute infallible certainty that a theory is true. The margin of error, however small, is always there.
Therefore, in the scientific lexicon, theories are never proven. They were supported by the evidence, they are refuted by the evidence, or they are modified by new evidence.
I want to push back on this on behalf of a frustrated student or even a frustrated policymaker. When you first learn that science relies on probability and constantly admits it might be making errors, it can feel incredibly destabilizing.
It feels like the ground is shifting beneath your feet.
Right. A policymaker might say, look, if statistics are just probabilities and you can't actually prove anything, why should I trust science? Why should I pass a law banning texting and driving if your cell phone simulator study didn't technically prove it's dangerous? It sounds like you were just guessing with fancy math.
It is a profound philosophical question, and it is true that bad actors often exploit this probabilistic nature to undermine legitimate science. They will point to the tiny margin of error and say, see, the scientists aren't 100% sure, so we can ignore them.
But recognizing the impossibility of absolute proof is not a weakness of the scientific method. It is its greatest, most resilient strength.
Humility is a strength, because while a single study doesn't prove a theory, science doesn't rely on single studies. It relies on the cyclical model. It relies on accumulation.
If one researcher finds that cell phones impair driving, it might be a type I error.
But if a researcher in Utah finds it, and then a totally independent lab in Tokyo finds it using a different simulator, and then a lab in London finds it by analyzing real-world insurance data.
Converging operations across multiple cycles.
Exactly. When you have 50 different studies using 50 different operational definitions across thousands of participants, and they all converge on the exact same conclusion, the probability that they are all making a type I false positive error simultaneously drops to a mathematical near impossibility.
We do not need absolute dogmatic proof to build a highly reliable, incredibly robust foundation for action.
Furthermore, dogma claims absolute proof. Dogma says, we know the absolute truth and we will never change our minds. Science says, this is the best, most highly supported model of reality we have based on current data.
By structurally admitting that we might be wrong, by formally acknowledging the existence of type I and type 2 errors, the scientific method keeps the door permanently open to self-correction.
If a better theory comes along, supported by better data, using more sensitive operational definitions, the scientific community will dismantle the old theory and adopt the new one.
Science is the only human endeavor that is structurally designed to prove itself wrong in the pursuit of becoming more right.
That is exactly it.
That is a phenomenal place to synthesize everything we have covered today. Let's do a quick, comprehensive recap of our journey through the machinery of psychology.
We started by examining the cyclical model of research, visualizing it not as a static circle, but as an upward spiral.
We saw how informal observations like stereotypes about gender and talkativeness and practical problems, like the rise of cell phones in cars, feed raw material into the scientific engine.
We demystified the research literature, exploring how databases like PsycInfo and the brutal gauntlet of double-blind peer review create a reliable foundation of past knowledge,
allowing researchers to find the gaps without reinventing the wheel. We tackled the process of evaluating research questions, balancing the thrilling theoretical pursuit of interestingness against the harsh logistical reality of feasibility, time, money, and IRB constraints.
We delineated the distinct architecture of theories and hypotheses. We saw how Zajont's drive theory provided a broad mechanism for audience effects, and how researchers use the hypothetico-deductive method to derive narrow, specific predictions from that broad rulebook.
We wrestled with taking invisible, conceptual human traits and forcing them into objective, quantifiable operational definitions, just like Bandura did with mallet strikes on a Bobo doll.
And finally, we arrived at the philosophy of statistical probability. We unpacked the dangers of type I false positives and type II false negatives.
And we discovered why the absence of absolute proof is actually the mechanism that allows science to continuously adapt and self-correct.
It is an intricate, occasionally frustrating, but ultimately beautiful system for uncovering the truth of human behavior.
As we close out this deep dive, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Let's circle all the way back to the very first moments of this conversation. The Mueller and Oppenheimer study from 2014 regarding laptops and note-taking.
We discussed how laptops bypassed the deep processing of synthesis because students were just transcribing verbatim.
But think about the technological landscape today. We aren't just dealing with fast typists anymore. We have AI auto-transcription software that can perfectly transcribe a lecture in real time.
We have AI models that can instantly synthesize that transcript into bullet points, flashcards, and conceptual summaries before the class even ends.
The environment has fundamentally shifted. The variables have changed entirely.
So how might we need to restart the research cycle right now?
If you were tasked with designing a study tomorrow to test learning in the era of AI integration, what would your hypothesis be? Does AI-generated synthesis replace the need for the human brain to experience cognitive friction?
How would you operationally define deep learning when the computer is doing the summarizing for you? What would be your control group?
The edge of the map has moved. It's a completely open frontier, waiting for a rigorous methodical researcher just like you to ask the right question.
The cycle is always waiting to begin again.
Remember, a fellow student, this audio deep dive is a tool to help you unpack the complex architecture of these concepts and synthesize the big picture. But it is absolutely not a replacement for doing the reading. Go dive into Chapter 2 of your text, trace the methodologies, study the precise vocabulary of the scientific method, and appreciate the immense effort it takes to turn an abstract thought into empirical data. Catch you on the next deep dive.